Well, we just heard the Prime Minister Boris Johnson giving a press conference in Poland ahead of the news on the escalating situation between Russia and Ukraine. Here to discuss this now is Dr. Domitilla Sagramoso, a lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Fantastic to have you on the programme, Domitilla. Russia today has come out and essentially accused the UK of braggadocio on the world stage to shore up public support back at home. Do you think that the UK's diplomatic efforts are going to reap any reward?
I'm afraid they won't. I think at the moment there are two elements. On the one hand, Russia gets very upset if someone goes to Moscow and openly sort of criticizes Russia's position or sort of openly gives the perception of lecturing the Russian leadership. That very much upsets the Kremlin at the moment because one of the underlying factors in all this crisis is a perception that Russia feels it's not being respected and its interests are not being taken into account. So any kind of very strong, open message that sounds aggressive is rejected immediately. And the second is that, unfortunately, because of the weakness of the government at home here in the UK is not seen really as a valid or respectable partner, and not as someone that can help, through diplomatic channels. There isn't a perception that the UK has taken a very strong stance in support of Ukraine and very critical of Russia's behavior. So for the Kremlin, this is a bit of a non-starter in any kind of diplomatic negotiations. So I think that I was never very optimistic because I thought that these kind of attempts, one might see them as positive. From the Russian perspective, they do not produce the expected results. I mean, the Russian government at the moment prefers the kind of approach that we've seen from President Macron, where there is an understanding of Russia's positions without necessarily sort of giving in our core values and principles. But this idea that there is a space for negotiations. And the position of the British government at the moment is very, very clear, very tough, no room for maneuver. So I was not surprised by the reaction of these negotiations or of this visit and how the Kremlin has reacted to it.
I mean, one thing that Vladimir Putin has said is that, frankly, he says that NATO is no longer an alliance of defence, that particular purpose ran out after the last Cold War, and instead it's become an aggressor on the world stage, citing Iraq, for example, and then says that to say to Russian troops, you can or cannot be where you are on Russian soil, they think is rather overstepping the line. Is not the problem here that while Boris Johnson was in Brussels talking at the headquarters of NATO, talking tough, in fact, and pointing out this could be an extremely perilous moment for Europe, and the first time in decades that we've been having to deploy knife-edge diplomacy, that the EU is very much split on this, with Germany saying that we don't want to involve Russia in sanctions with the international SWIFT payment system. They've obviously got their interests in Russian gas. And as you're saying, President Macron of France almost taking a more conciliatory tone. If Europe can't speak in harmony on this, then what hope do we have of facing down the power play of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I tend to disagree with this idea that Europe is completely split. I think there are different approaches to resolving this problem. And there are those like the UK who feel, or the Baltic states or the Poles who feel that only very strong language and rearmament or mobilization is going to send a clear message. When I mean rearmament, I mean support for Ukraine militarily, that only this is going to send the right message. And there are those who have remained firm in their commitment to support Ukraine's territorial integrity, but are trying to find a diplomatic solution. And I think I personally see these as complementary. Of course, there are positions that are not as strong as we would have liked, especially among the German government, which has not been ready to take a very tough position. And that has created a lot of concerns. But I am of the view that this was made clear by the German Chancellor, that if Russia invades, the situation is going to be very different. And I wouldn't be surprised if Germany also then adopts very tough measures and gives up, for example, Nord Stream 2. What I think countries like France are trying to do, and maybe Germany in a minor way, is trying to find an avenue of dialogue where some kind of agreement can be found to avert a military intervention. But I think the alliance as such, and that includes the Europeans, are on one line as to not changing their positions on NATO enlargement. That was mentioned very clearly by Macron, making clear that Russia does not have a say, does not have a sphere of influence, that it cannot decide the future of Ukraine's geostrategic orientation, that the NATO countries are ready to engage with Russia on issues around nuclear weapons proliferation, for example, or issues around transparency or military maneuvers. So there are a lot of areas where there is room for negotiations. And this has been the position overall of the alliance. So I think we are seeing different views about how to go around this, but I wouldn't say that there is such a significant split in the alliance. I think that the alliance is strong in terms of not so far, they haven't given in on any major point which Russia has been demanding. There have been no concessions on the side of the Europeans or the Americans. On the contrary, we've seen every country in their way trying to provide support. Some have provided more than others. The Germans and the Italians have been much weaker in their sort of support for Ukraine, but they haven't sort of given in or changed positions in terms of the NATO alliance, NATO enlargement, or the support for territorial integrity of Ukraine. So when we look at the positions, and also we have to look, for example, at the declarations of the European Council and what Josep Borrell has said, it's very clear that the sanctions, which are European and have been agreed by all European members, are going to kick in if there is an invasion. So I think we have to always also look a bit at the declarations that come from the Council of Europe as a united European forum. The Brits, of course, are no longer part of these mechanisms, but I think that there is also coordination with them. And I don't think it is a bad idea to have countries that try to reach out to Russia to see if a military operation can be averted.
Dr. Domitilla Sagramoso, thank you so much for being on the programme today. That's Dr. Domitilla Sagramoso, who is a lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Well, joining me in the studio today is political columnist at The Sun, Trevor Kavanagh. Trevor, I mean, what happens next is anybody's guess. But do you think that the sort of very strident stance that the UK is taking on the world stage, very much leading the world in trying to push Putin back, is the right move?
Well, I think it's the right move for Boris Johnson at the moment when he is struggling for survival back home. War is a great sort of distraction. But I think that we have to accept the fact that Britain is not going to go to war against Russia. It's not going to put military boots on the ground in fighting force terms in Ukraine. We are doing what I think is probably right in the sense that we're giving the Ukrainian troops the anti-tank missiles that they can defend themselves with, and to some extent maybe make it a little less attractive for the Russians to invade. But we are not going to go to war over Ukraine. And to be absolutely honest, we're never going to allow Ukraine to join the NATO organization. We may wish them to, we may have wished them to, but it's a bit like Turkey joining the European Union. It was never going to happen, and it isn't going to happen. So if we can somehow convey that point to Vladimir Putin, then I think that would be valuable. At the moment, we've got our fists raised, and that isn't going down well in Moscow.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, that the message from the Kremlin today has very much been that we know your game, Boris Johnson. We know you've got difficulties back at home. Then you had that photograph of Liz Truss posing in a fur hat in Red Square, emulating that picture of Margaret Thatcher 35 years ago. Is there a risk that they're overplaying clumsy propaganda here and in doing so, almost playing into Russian hands?
Well, I think so. And Liz Truss is posing everywhere in a tank, in fur hats and all sorts of Iron Lady sort of settings. I think this has got a long tail. We go back to the fall of the Berlin Wall when we decided that history was over and we could reap the peace dividend. And what we actually did was dismantle NATO in all but name. And it's more or less fallen to pieces ever since. And now, when it's needed, it's a scramble to make it look like a coherent organization again. And Putin can see through that. There's no real resilience here. And the visit by Macron over the last couple of days has also made it clear that Europe wants a deal and he's trying to lead it.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Sagramoso was sort of saying quite the opposite there, but it seems to me that this is creating a big division between transatlantic approach to geopolitical manoeuvring and a European approach. And of course, there is Germany's need or desire to carry on importing gas from Russia and the construction of this new Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And the Eastern European states are wanting to pivot back to joining the transatlantic alliance. I mean, what is the hope moving forwards? Because Putin's going to want to walk away with a scalp, surely.
He cannot afford not to walk away with the scalp. And at the moment, he's got the upper hand. And I disagree with your guest to some extent in the sense that she says that NATO and Europe is not divided. It is divided. Germany is looking east, not west. It's got its gas pipelines. Vladimir Putin has basically got us all by the short hairs because he's got the gas reserves on which very large swathes of Europe depend for 100% of all their inward energy resources. So, and we're all dancing to that particular tune because even though we only get 10%, the world markets are diving all over the place because of the Russian military operations. He will get something. He will actually, I think he's already won it actually. Russia is not going to, won't need to invade in order to come out winning from this. And it has to win for domestic consumption.
Yeah, Trevor, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. Well, there we go. Tensions escalating there, and Boris Johnson giving what could be a seminal press conference in Poland. I want to know what your views are. What do you think about the Russia and Ukraine tensions? Should we be involved? Is the Prime Minister playing a blinder, or is he trying to distract from what's going on back at home, and potentially in doing so only escalating tensions? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or of course you can tweet us at GBNews.